All right, ask everybody to bear with me. My voice took a step backwards this week, and as long as I don't get too high of a voice, I'm registered. So I have to speak kind of low and into the microphone. So, we are finishing up Proverbs. Tonight, Lord willing, that will be what we accomplish and move on to the Song of Solomon. So, where we left off last week was in discussing some of the lessons that can be learned from the book of Proverbs. One of the first things that we discussed, hold on a second. That's weird. Oh, it's still muted. There we go. One of the first lessons that we discussed was from a more of an observation with regard to Proverbs as well as Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. But we know that Solomon, being such a wise man, being gifted with that wisdom from God based on his request, just because someone's wise doesn't mean that they're perfect. And that's one of the lessons that we learn in recognizing that while Proverbs has so many wise sayings in it, and there's so much warning in it, that just because someone has great wisdom, it doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect or sinless, as certainly Solomon was not. Also, kind of attached to that, and that's where we left off last week, but possessing great wisdom can cause people to not be as circumspect or aware as we're called to be in the New Testament, and certainly it was the same in the Old Testament regarding people of faith, as we should be with our own hearts and our own minds and the character that God wants from us. Solomon allowed his heart to be taken away into idolatry, but he was the wisest man to ever live, according to what God told Solomon, that there would be none, there was none like him before him, nor will there ever be after him. Obviously, Solomon did not pay as close attention to himself as he should have, whether he was puffed up by his own wisdom or was paying too much attention to others than himself. The lesson remains to be aware of ourselves and what we are doing. And of course, we know that Solomon, it didn't happen overnight, but as Solomon married all these women from these other nations, and he didn't require them, apparently, to reject the false idols and to worship Jehovah, gradually it led his heart astray. And so, and of course, as we consider Ecclesiastes after the Song of Solomon, we're going to notice Solomon's mind as he looks back on his past and as he looks back on the things that he'd done and gained lessons himself from those mistakes. Anything through the first two lessons that we learn, kind of looking at not just the text of Proverbs, but also who wrote it. Wrote most of it. All right, third one, just because someone has great wisdom that applies to different areas of life does not mean that that person is spiritually wise. There's a lot of different types of wisdom that we can gain in this world that has spiritual application and vice versa. There's a lot of spiritual wisdom that can apply to business, can apply to sports, can apply to all kinds of different physical elements, but they're not always interchangeable. While all wisdom is either born from experience or from teaching, not all wisdom carries over to the Spirit. Wisdom can be very specialized. Wisdom formed from business experience and learning, for instance, will not necessarily carry over to spiritual wisdom. There are some elements, certainly, from the business world and from the sports world that can be carried over. I mean, just from our invitations that some of our guys do, we know that there's all kinds of analogies that we can take from everyday life and apply it to our spiritual life. But there's also quite a bit that doesn't transfer over either. This is a lesson that many Christians fail to take into account. And I've seen this firsthand especially with regard to business, where, because I've had one Christian a couple of years ago just tell me that, and he was a business owner, and he said he had a hard time separating the way his mind worked with regard to his business and then the way his mind should work with regard to the church. And it was very hard for him to separate the two. And as a result, he felt like he had made some I guess you could say he could have done some things better had he been able to have his mind where he felt it needed to be in the spiritual realm as opposed to in the business realm. And so that's one application of that. Anything through the third one? All right, fourth one. Wisdom is a necessary and valuable tool for the Christian as long as it is coupled with action. And really what it boils down to is that knowledge, having the knowledge is great. You know, you can quote book, chapter, and verse, you know, any and every, your walking concordance, that sort of thing. That's great. That's wonderful. I know Florida College, one of the things at the upper D class, these are guys who are in the upper division of the biblical studies at Florida College. They were required, for instance, in one of the fellows' classes to memorize all of the book of Ephesians. That's great, okay, if you can memorize the book of Ephesians. But it doesn't do any good if you're not able to actually utilize it. And so wisdom is the knowledge, having that knowledge and understanding how it applies to my life. But then comes the next step of actually doing it, of actually taking the action involved. Much of the wisdom from Solomon details the reasoning behind an action or inaction and the consequences associated with both. We can be as wise as Solomon, but if we don't put that wisdom to good use to be better servants and help those around us, it profits us nothing. And so great knowledge is a great blessing. Having great wisdom, either born from learning or from experience, is also a wonderful thing to have as a Christian. But we need to actually be able to utilize it, put it into action. And you see that difference with Solomon himself in his life. Just because he had great wisdom did not prevent him from neglecting that wisdom as he, as king, as an example to his people, allowed his heart to go astray. So it's actually putting that wisdom into practice, into action, and using it the way God wants us to. Anything through that fourth lesson? Yes, sir.
Could we go so far as to say not all wisdom is good? Thinking about the Bible talks that we're to seek the wisdom from above, not wisdom of this earth. And, you know, we might admire somebody who has street smarts and knows how to survive and do things, but some of their principles and values aren't necessarily based in things that we would agree with or that God would agree with.
Sure.
So just wisdom in and of itself, and I know in the study of Proverbs, it's a particular wisdom that's under consideration.
Right.
Just kind of separating those two.
Absolutely. And that kind of goes back to the fact that not all aspects of wisdom that we can gain from the world, I mean, there are analogies that we can connect from one to the other, but not all of it does transfer over. You know, having the knowledge and the ability to survive and that sort of thing, that's great and that's wonderful as long as we have the proper values and we have the proper perspective. But without that, it doesn't do anything for us. In fact, if anything, it puts us in a worse situation, because a lot of times individuals of the world, I'm sure we all know some individuals that because they have success in their physical lives, they're kind of puffed up, they're very proud of themselves, they're proud of what they are able to do or to accomplish, what they've done in the past, how they're able to judge the character of a person and so forth, and that can blind them to really seeing the things that they need to see, especially with regard to the spirit, but it can even have physical consequences as well. Just as Paul warned the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And that certainly is an application of wisdom.
In chapter 13, throws that in the middle of application of these abilities they've got.
Right.
But you've got to have love.
You have to have love.
It doesn't matter, you can do anything.
Right. Well, and that was in the context of gifts of prophecy, gift of knowledge. And Paul brings out there at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, those first 4 verses, he describes, I could have all knowledge and all wisdom, but if I don't have love, it doesn't profit me anything. So having knowledge is great, having wisdom by itself is great, but there must be action coupled with it that is focused on God and focused on serving God. Otherwise, it doesn't do any good. Yeah. And like Nolan said, not all wisdom is good wisdom if it's not utilized for the sake of serving God properly. That certainly is the application of that point, is that some wisdom can be used to further my own agendas, my own desires, to serve myself, whereas as our fellows bring out in lessons and in invitations, there's a lot of wisdom of the world that we can take and utilize to motivate us and to observe lessons for ourselves as Christians to serve God better and to serve each other better. All right, anything else through lesson 4? And again, these are more broad lessons as opposed to the specifics. As we went through our notes in Proverbs, we didn't go chapter by chapter, and so kind of wanted to take a more of a overall type of picture with our lessons as well. Anything else through that? Okay, that pretty much finishes our lesson on Proverbs. The last thing is just the outline, and you have your notes. You can look at that if you'd like. The first 29 chapters are written by Solomon, and then thereafter you have chapter 30 that Agur, the son of Jacob, wrote, and then King Lemuel, chapter 31. And as we talked about before, there are those who suggest that both Agur and King Lemuel were simply pseudonyms for Solomon. I don't believe there's any reason to make that argument. I think Solomon invited these men because of their wisdom to write and add their proverbs to his wisdom, and so that these are certainly just as inspired and just as divinely given as anything that Solomon wrote. All right, anything else through our Proverbs study? And again, and in the future, if we want to focus and go chapter by chapter in Proverbs, or for that matter, in Psalms or any of the other things that we studied, that it's more of an overview, let me know. And we can, at some point in the future, we can go back and kind of go more in depth and in detail. And as we're going to do that with the Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, because those are shorter books. And so that it will be easier to go chapter by chapter. I just didn't want to get bogged down in Psalms and the 31 chapters of Proverbs, where there's not a lot of continuous context. All right, anything else through Proverbs? All right, let's flip over to Song of Solomon then, our notes. And we'll start out with our notes. We'll go through our notes first, and then we'll come back to the actual text. All right. And I apologize, I keep forgetting. I have a format where I can utilize these notes, and it makes it a lot bigger and easier to read up there. I know this is really small for a lot of you, especially those of you in the back. I'll try to remember next class to make sure I flip over the notes to that format that I have that makes it easier to read. All right. So, the background on the Song of Solomon, this is kind of it's an interesting background when you start reading commentaries, you start reading the biblical scholars and their thoughts on the Song of Solomon. It's known by 3 different names. Of course, the Song of Solomon is what we're used to thinking about, Canticles, and the Song of Songs. These are the 3 ways in which it is referred, it is known. The Hebrew lends itself in this way. This is kind of a literal interpretation of the actual Hebrew that is used. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And that phrase, the Song of Songs, it represents the emphasis on the fact that this is the finest of songs. And of course we know, and we'll notice that in our notes here in just a minute, 1 Kings chapter 4, how that Solomon, he wrote many proverbs, but he also wrote many songs as well. And the Song of Solomon, as far as what we have recorded for us, this is the only one we have that has been saved for us by God through His providence. It is one of 5 books that comprise the Megillah, which are read at various Jewish holidays. And there's several different holidays that are important to the Jews where certain things are read. Purim, of course, is related with Esther. In fact, the holiday of Purim is directly related to as we talked about last Sunday, to the day that the Jews conquered their enemies in the land of the Medes and the Persians. That brought about the Feast of Purim and that holiday. Ruth is read at Pentecost. Song of Solomon is read at Passover. Ecclesiastes is read at the Feast of Tabernacles. And Lamentations is read at the anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem. And so these are kind of 5 of the main times for the Jews to observe these particular holidays. And a lot of them aren't necessarily, other than Pentecost and Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles, the anniversary of the fall of Jerusalem and Purim, again, which goes back to the book of Esther, when the Jews conquered their enemies, those two were never commanded by God. Okay, you think about it's the Jewish holiday it's the Festival of Lights instead of Christmas. What is it called? Hanukkah. Thank you. I apologize. Hanukkah. Hanukkah. So I mean, Hanukkah in and of itself, that goes back to a tradition. It has nothing to do with anything commanded by God, just like Purim or the fall of Jerusalem. All of those are traditions of the Jews that they have kept alive over the generations. There are those that suggest that this song was written for Solomon rather than by Solomon, given the way that the Hebrew is written. There are some scholars that suggest that someone else wrote it about Solomon or for him to be sung in his court. But the style in which the song is written lends itself very favorably in supporting that it was written by Solomon. Style of language is similar to that of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and that goes back to the Hebrew that is used. It has a specific type of Hebrew. It is written in the Egyptian poetic form. Very few in Israel other than Solomon would have been familiar enough with the style and educated enough in that type of writing, especially given his experience in writing, to be able to write a song in that manner. In addition, we have biblical basis to understand Solomon regularly wrote songs. We also find that the text supports the dating of Solomon's time because there's references to great luxury as well as cities and towns that existed while Israel was still united. And of course, as soon as Solomon dies, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, there's going to be a split between in Israel, and it's going to result in two nations, Israel and Judah. And so the references that the Song of Solomon makes refers to a time while Israel was still all one kingdom. And so certainly all of this leads us to believe what the song says about it being the Song of Solomon. All right, so anything through the background of the Song of Solomon? Any thoughts on those two points? All right. The Song of Solomon is not quoted in the rest of the Bible anywhere, the Old Testament or the New Testament. And certainly given the nature of the text of the Song of Solomon, and we'll get into that in just a minute, there's an understanding why. And I'll point that out here in just a moment. Now, when it comes to the interpretations of the Song of Solomon, there are a whole host of interpretations that go way beyond the text and utilizes these things to bring out all kinds of applications and parallels and so forth. The most common one probably that we've heard about is that the Song of Solomon is actually an allegory for the love between Christ and the church. There are some Christian, I say Christian loosely, commentators that have recorded this particular idea, that the Song of Solomon, its whole purpose in the Old Testament was a foreshadowing of the relationship between Christ and the church. I completely disagree with that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Another allegorical interpretation is Solomonic praise for Israel's deliverance. Martin Luther put forward this idea, that this is an allegory for the love of Solomon for Israel and for the deliverance from God to Israel. There's no basis in the text for this. Martin Luther just kind of was coming up with different things. The depiction of time from David to Christ and from Christ to his return. Both Targum and Brightman, who are biblical scholars, they've suggested that this is a reference to kind of a imagery and allegory of describing the period of time, first of all, from David to Jesus, and then the second part of it is from Jesus, from the time that Jesus leaves to his return. And they break that up by David to Jesus is the male part of the song, and then when the woman starts speaking, because the song is a duet, we'll talk about that in just a minute, in the woman's part of the song is from when Christ has gone until he returns. And again, there's nothing in the text that suggests this, but again, this is something that they throw out there. Another allegorical interpretation is that the lady of the song is Mary, the mother of Jesus. This is something that in Roman Catholicism that is promoted quite a bit. That the lady of the song being Mary there's a lot of different thoughts as to, well, who's the male? Is it Joseph? Is it God? Who is it? But that's what the Roman Catholicism believes, is that it's representative of Mary. There is no evidence of allegory being used in the Song of Solomon. In fact, most examples of allegory include fantastic imagery or obvious allusions, and no such devices exist with this song. It is man that finds and attributes allegorical interpretation within this book as opposed to taking it for what it is. And I firmly believe in that. I do not believe that the Song of Solomon is in any way an allegory for some future element in the New Testament. The strongest evidence that contradicts allegorical interpretation is the full extent of sexual language that is used. When you read Song of Solomon chapter 5 verse 1, chapter 7 verses 7 through 8, we'll get to those later, and others, it would be wholly inappropriate to attribute Christ's love for the church in this manner. Even though the church is likened as the bride or wife of Christ in the New Testament, it is done so to express the deep love for one for the other, not eros, which is the sexual, romantic, lustful love, as a husband for a wife and a wife for a husband. That's the type of love that Song of Solomon expresses. Eros, in fact, the term eros, which is a Greek term, we talk about the term love. You've got agape, you've got phileo, you've got eros. Two of those three are utilized all throughout the New Testament. Eros is never once used in the New Testament because that refers to that sexual attraction, that sexual relationship, that sexual desire. And certainly in the New Testament, not that type of feelings or those types of actions between a married couple is in any way wrong. But the focus is on thinking beyond myself. That's agape. I'm willing to sacrifice myself. And the relationship that exists between a husband and a wife and through with brethren and phileo, eros is not a focus in the New Testament. But this is the focus of the Song of Solomon. It is entirely about, there is certain element that you can see that you could relate to perhaps agape and to phileo, but the overarching type of love is eros. It's where we get the term erotic from. That's where the Greek starts. It's eros. And that's the type of love that Solomon describes. All right, anything through the allegorical interpretation of this? And we're going to get to the dramatic interpretation here in just a minute, and then actually talk about what I believe the Song of Solomon is actually about. Okay, so the dramatic interpretation. There are those who think that this was written, many people believe it was written by Solomon, and of course, as I mentioned before, there are those who think it was written for Solomon, but it wasn't. It's the two-character drama, story of mutual love between Solomon and a Shulamite girl, and this is being put forward as if this is some fictional text. That's why we're using this dramatic interpretation, that it's being written either by Solomon or for Solomon, but it's not actually fiction, or it's not non-fiction. It's not actually real. It's all fictional. It's all make-believe, and that's where the drama or theater of it comes in. The three-character drama, because when we go through the Song of Solomon, we'll read about this a little bit. You have the man and the woman, but then there's also a shepherd that is mentioned as well. And some people get the feeling that it's a three-character drama, that it is a story in which Solomon attempts to woo the Shulamite girl away from her true love, the shepherd lover. This interpretation suggests that the Song of Solomon were as a script to a play or a romance novel. There is no evidence to support this. First, no such writings have ever been found that show that this was even a genre of writing in ancient times. This would make Song of Solomon the first and only of its kind, with no contemporary proof to show that this interpretation is accurate. Secondly, one must read a great deal into the text to make it work, to the point that you add even more to the text than with the allegorical interpretations that we noted earlier. Thirdly, all dramatic works have conflict or obstacles to be overcome. That's part of what makes it a drama, is that there's some obstacle, there's something, some twist, some plot, some purpose. But the Song of Solomon has no story to give it a dramatic leaning. In fact, there's no real dialogue between the two parties at all. There's no actual conversation taking place. It's more like a duet in which one speaks and then the other separately. Okay, so you have the man who speaks about his love, then you have the woman who speaks about her love, not necessarily in direct response to what he said or he responding to her. There's none of that. So it doesn't lend itself in any way to some kind of dramatic interpretation. The reason I wanted to bring some of these interpretations out is in case you ever come across, Song of Solomon isn't necessarily one of those common conversation pieces among even the religious people, but if it ever comes up or you ever hear something about it, at least you'll have kind of a basis to kind of know how to proceed. That's why we're covering these. Other interpretations of note, there is the historical interpretation that this is an actual account of Solomon attempting to woo a girl away from her love. The cultic interpretation, and this is way out there, but that this is erotic literature designed and written for a particular group of people that find pleasure in reading such material. Some variations of this include an interpretation of the two people in the song as idols, a god and a goddess, such as Baal and Astra. Then there's the wedding interpretation, that the entire book is an elaborate record of Solomon's marriage to a Shulamite girl. I don't believe any of those are accurate. Okay, the historical one would be the closest one that I would agree with, but even then, Solomon wooing a girl away from her love, I don't buy into that. And that's why we're going to go chapter by chapter in the Song of Solomon to discuss this. There's the love song interpretation. To me, this is what the Song of Solomon is. It's a song. It is not an account so much. It's not a story. It's not fiction. It's not a drama. It's a song. It's a love song. The best way to view the Song of Solomon is simply for what it is. A love song, sung by a woman, a man, and at times their friends. Whether or not this is an actual recording of a real love of Solomon, or if Solomon is using literary license to teach about love, we cannot be 100% certain. While there are points in the song that sound as if it could be a real event in Solomon's life, Solomon was not necessarily known for his true love style, nor is any special person ever mentioned in the reign of Solomon. Not that there couldn't have been, but we know he had, I forget the exact numbers, he had hundreds of wives and concubines. I mean, there were a lot of loves in his life. We don't ever read about one in particular, one special person. There may have been, but we don't know for sure. And so whether this is an accurate Solomon actually revealing his heart regarding this woman, or Solomon talking about this type of relationship, maybe wishing he had this type of relationship, whatever the case is. Regardless of its real or fictional nature, lessons can be gained by the love being shown. So any thoughts on that last one? Because to me, this is the best interpretation. This is a love song. It is what it is. There's no reason to add anything to it. No reason to take stuff away from it. All the other interpretations do that. Just take it for what it is. It's a love song. Whether it's Solomon expressing his love for this Shulamite girl, or Solomon expressing the type of love that is shown between a man and a woman, in this case, Solomon and a Shulamite girl. Either way, this is Solomon putting forward these thoughts for a reason, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So any thoughts on that last one? And again, I'm not in any way, I tend to think that this probably is I tend to think that Solomon's writing about emotions he himself has. Whether these emotions, he's describing them utilizing a song in this way, or there's an actual girl that he desires or that he married. I tend to think Solomon is expressing something intimate, something personal for him. Whether or not it's fictional, I don't like using that word when it comes to the Bible, fictional, in the sense that it's representative of, or if it's an actual account of words spoken, I don't know for sure. But I do believe firmly that these are these are his intimate feelings and thoughts. Again, whether this is wishing he had this type of relationship with one special woman, or he really did have these feelings for a Shulamite girl. I don't know. So, any thoughts on that last part? Yes, sir.
Just generally speaking, not that it ultimately decides it, but like in the story of Lazarus, when a character has a name, or in this case, from a particular place, that tends to lend a little bit of credence to it being a real situation, not necessarily, but
Right. Well, and of course, the what we call the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus utilized Lazarus, whether this was the Lazarus that had died that Jesus raised from the dead, or this is some other Lazarus, something like that. It could be a similar thought process that this didn't have to be a real life event for Jesus to make the points, and that's what a proverb was, or a parable. Sorry, parable is a real life example of something that is used to make a spiritual point, and that's what Jesus was doing certainly there as well. So. I definitely believe that Solomon wrote it, that these are his feelings, whether they're directly for this girl or wishing he had this person, I don't know for sure. All right. Anything else to that? All right, the purpose of the song. While it may seem strange to some that the Bible should contain love poetry, we must understand that Solomon taught concerning how to live. That's with Proverbs, the wisdom that we need in order to live properly before God, and how to enjoy life, and for that matter, to recognize the purpose of life. That's what Ecclesiastes is all about. It makes sense that he would write something concerning how to love, okay? Because he taught about how to live, he taught about how to properly have the right perspective and enjoy life. It makes sense that we would have recorded something about love in this text. Especially if he was towards the end of his life and is considering mistakes that he had made over the course of his life. And again, I've seen all kinds of datings of Solomon. Most tend to think that this is kind of coupled with Ecclesiastes for a reason. That you've got Proverbs at the beginning, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes at the end. So again, while the marriage relationship is meant to be a partnership and friendship, that does not mean that the sexual and emotional aspects of love are not worthy of attention, or that they do not even have biblical attention. In fact, many of Paul's letters contain specific instructions regarding the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. And especially this and this next point with regard to the lessons to be learned, to me, this is the purpose of why God has included the Song of Solomon for us. Okay, because no other text deals with the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife like Solomon does. Okay, no other text. There's no text in the New Testament. There's references. The marriage bed is undefiled. That's in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. There's references to the sexual relationship, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and so forth. But the explicit nature of the words used in the Song of Solomon is unlike anything else in the Bible, and I think that's for a reason. Okay. So, and we'll talk about these lessons to be learned. We're going to go through all of the notes, and then we're going to go chapter by chapter in the Song of Solomon. While certain sexual relationships are condemned, and that has to do with the relationships themselves, okay, because someone has no right to be married or whatnot, the marriage bed is undefiled. It is important to understand that sexuality is a good thing protected by marriage, not an evil thing made permissible by marriage. There is a huge difference between those two. And in our culture, especially looking back over the last couple hundred years, I think man has tended more towards the view that sexuality is a bad thing that is made okay when you get married. And that's not at all the way God intended it or created it. He created it as a good thing, as a blessing that man perverts, that man turns into a bad thing because he's not utilizing these blessings God has given the way God has described. And so when he says in when I have these notes here, we often have a very taboo mentality regarding sex, much to the detriment of our children and even ourselves. God created man and woman for purposes, for roles, and yes, even for enjoyment, sexual or otherwise. And we see that reference in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, how that a man shall leave his father and mother, cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Paul directly, a lot of times we apply that as they become joined in mind and in purpose. Well, yeah, that's true. That's the idea of a relationship, of that binding together. But Paul specifically applies this in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 as being the sexual relationship, that physical relationship of the two becoming one flesh. That's what Paul says because he uses it in a context dealing with sexual immorality. And so Paul specifically referenced that for a reason. Jesus himself, in talking about marriage, quoted that exact scripture as well. The song teaches us that sexual and physical love should be enjoyed and celebrated within the proper relationship that God has blessed. To me, this is why the Song of Solomon is in the Bible, because it is a reminder that marriage is given to us to enjoy, to have a companion, and yes, for the purpose of the sexual relationship as well. That's one of the things Paul deals with in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. To avoid sexual immorality, to avoid fornication, let each man have a wife and a wife or husband. So we have in, let's see, while there is no part of the Song of Solomon quoted in the New Testament, several of our hymns do take inspiration from the Song of Solomon, such as Lily of the Valley and Jesus, Rose of Sharon. In the Song Solomon chapter 2 verse 1, we see these references being made, which suggest either certain references in Song of Solomon as being about Christ, that's what the hymn writers had in their mind, or that these references can be attributed to Christ. This is incorrect. However, this does not make these hymns unscriptural. We should simply take note of the actual meanings of these references. So it's not that these hymns, that we shouldn't sing them, but when we sing them and we think about, hey, wait a minute, the Lily of the Valley and Jesus, Rose of Sharon, those are references to the Song of Solomon. Yes, they are. And the hymnists who wrote them most likely had in their mind the other common interpretation that this is somehow the relationship of Christ and the church. It's not. However, there's nothing wrong with depicting Jesus as the Rose of Sharon from the perspective of him being something that we are seeking after. Okay, not in the sexual sense the way Solomon utilizes it, but in the sense that we want to be close to Christ. The lily of the valley, that this is more valuable, more perfect than anything else, and certainly Christ is. So just as long as we keep that mindset and understanding when we sing these hymns, there's nothing wrong with it. But certainly don't take from those hymns that means that somehow Song of Solomon is about Christ and the church, because it's not. All right. Any thoughts through the lessons to be learned, A, B, and C? Okay. So there is no outline for the Song of Solomon. The song is much like a real song, a duet with a soprano, a tenor, and a chorus. And you see both of these. You see a man, a woman, and then you hear the friends speaking as well. There are little means of outlining this song, as the point of the song is simply to express the deep affection and love of one for the other. And those are the notes. Any thoughts on, especially focusing on the interpretation of it regarding Christ and the church versus just being a love song, and especially the applications that we gain from it regarding, I believe the whole reason we have it is to support and promote this is why we have the marriage relationship. This is a blessing from God. And it is not wrong for Solomon or for the Shulamite girl to respond the way that they do. Okay, the words that they use, and fair warning, next Wednesday when we go through this text, there is some explicit language in this text. But it is utilized in a manner that God has approved. It is with a husband and a wife. It is a blessing. And so when we read through this, our natural reaction is to cringe or to shy away. It's that side of us that we have been trained to kind of taboo. But in many ways, we need to recognize that this is a blessing that man takes and perverts. And we need to understand that God gives this to us for a reason. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with starting with our text next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.